Welcome back, everyone, to another Adventure Box podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. We love telling you about history. And there is so much to teach you, so much to talk about, especially as we come into ancient Mesopotamia. Now, Mesopotamia it has amazing history because it's actually one of the earliest civilizations in the world. One of. There are many different civilizations, or you could say cradles of civilization. What does that mean? Okay, so you might be asking, what is a cradle of civilization? Because they could say Incas was a cradle of civilization, Egypt was a cradle of civilization, and Mesopotamia is a cradle of civilization. Now, when we are saying cradle of civilization, we're talking about the birthplace of some of the first complex societies. These were places where humans first developed cities, governments, writing systems, and organizing religion. Mesopotamia holds this title because it is the home of one of the earliest advanced civilizations. Now, think of a cradle as you would rocking a baby or having a baby. You put them in the cradle. The cradle is where the baby grows. It will grow until it expands past that, and then it floods over. So Mesopotamia basically nurtured the growth of human culture, learning, and innovation, laying the foundation for future civilizations, because they would overflow. They would leave Mesopotamia and grow and create other civilizations. Now, Mesopotamia, as it was not an actual civilization. It was not a group of people that distinguished themselves as one thing. No, it was a lot of different people when it first began. But let's go through one other thing I want to make sure that you understand. Mesopotamia, what does it mean? Okay, there's a reason why it's called Mesopotamia. In the Greeks, mesos means middle, and potamos means river. Mesopotamos, Mesopotamia, combined means the land between rivers. I want to show you a map of this because this is actually quite interesting to think about. Okay, so you have this right here is the Tigris River. It spans all the way up here in Iraq. This is the Euphrates River, also in Iraq, and comes in from Syria. So, and also into what we used to call Canaan area. And it would come down to this confluence, which is around where Baghdad is. Now, if you remember the Iraq War, if you were around that time, or if you've heard about the Iraq War, Baghdad was the main city in Iraq where the leadership is, the capital of the country. Well, the reason why is, look here. What is all this? This is greenery. These are fertile soils. So why the Tigris and the Euphrates River? Is because it would flood and it would soak the soils. It would also bring the silt up from the water onto the land, which was very fertile. It would help fertilize. And the silt is a mixture of everything from like dead fish, dead organic materials such as like trees or vegetation, algae, all these different things. It'd be mixed up. It would be basically decomposed. And then during the floods, it would wash up onto shores where it would actually settle, and then they would plant on it. They'd plant wheat. They'd plant barley. They'd grow their animals in that area. So these were all complex things and reasons why they came to this area. So this is the earliest portion of Mesopotamia. It's basically between these two rivers. So basically all of this land right here was Mesopotamia. All of Iraq. And some of Syria, some of other areas around it. But that's one thing to really understand before we get into this curriculum. So the Mesopotamia is so essential in this area because it allowed for humans to grow. Now, here's another thing to think about. Okay, so we talked about ancient Africa, then ancient Egypt, so Africa over here, then ancient Egypt. Then we came into ancient Israel, which we will be also doing ancient Arab nations. We're also going to be doing Persia. We're going to be doing the Indus Valley and India. But now we're going to be talking about Mesopotamia, because this includes Babylon, the Medes. These are some of the biggest civilizations in the beginning. They're the first ones to basically take over the Middle East. And you know, Middle East has been in war ever since 2900 BC. So over 5,000 years has this land been fought over, because again, a cradle of human life. So what were some of the challenges? Well, the soils were fertile. The flood wasn't always predictable. So you had people that were living there, and then all of a sudden they have these mass floods that would come in and wash out their crops or kill the people. So this is also one of the things where they actually had to create irrigation in the area so that the floods didn't destroy their land, didn't destroy their crops, didn't destroy them. So, and the irrigation is more than just creating a canal of water. No. It's creating walls where you need it. It's creating smaller channels so you can get water into certain areas. But also, here's a big one. In the United States, we'll just give an example, there was a lot of marshland. And there was marshland where basically humans wanted to settle. So what would marshland do? It would spur mosquitoes, right? Mosquitoes would bring malaria, would bring other diseases. And so the humans would die. So the humans would smart up and they would realize, okay, we need to create canals to drain the water from the land, get it away from the land, which would allow us to, one, plant, but also to keep the mosquito larvae from harvesting. Now, if you don't know about mosquitoes, okay, think around your house. Do you have a pot that's been sitting around stagnant water? It's just been sitting with water that has not moved over a long period of time. That is the best place for mosquitoes to develop. I have 3 ponds on the side of my house. They're basically a tiered waterfall that I built myself. And so each of these are stagnant water. So they are perfect for mosquito larvae to grow and become stronger. So when we first built that, we decided we need to have fish in there. Now, we could get goldfish, but some of the ponds are too shallow. So we actually went down to the local stream and grabbed local fish and put them into the different pots of water, the little bodies of water. Those fish eat the larvae. Those fish, if frozen, because they're natural to this area, they can actually reconstitute themselves. They can actually come back to life. They don't die. They just completely freeze, and then they can actually come back to life. So we have these 3 pots. We don't have the mosquito issue that we had before, but we also have a chicken feeder. Okay, so we have chickens on the side of our house. Now these chickens, they have a pot which allows for water for them to be able to drink. In that stagnant water, even if it has a big container on top, mosquitoes plant the larvae. They go into the tank where it just waits. There's always water there. And then after a while, like if you unscrew the top to put more water in the top, they all escape. And there's a ton of mosquitoes that come at one time. So we're still working on that. Okay. So it's not a solid answer to everyone's problems to irrigate, but here it was. Okay, let's go back to what we were talking about. Okay, so with this fertile land, they were able to irrigate. It's one of the first places that people were able to irrigate. So that was really good. They dug canals, ditches, directed water more appropriately. They stopped the floods from destroying their area. They were also able to learn about crops, wheat, barley, dates, lentils, and other things that became their diet. So whatever they could grow became their diet. Now, raising animals. Now, here's another thing. So this is, let me go back just a little bit. This is all part of the time of the Neolithic era. I know we talked about it a lot when we were talking about African history. We talked about it a little bit more when we went to African, and we didn't even touch it when we were talking about ancient Israel. So the Neolithic era was basically when they had people and groups starting to come together and settle in one spot. Before that, they were all nomads. They were walking around. moving around. And we're actually going to learn about some of those nomads on Thursday. But at this point, let's keep going further. So they have agriculture. They're growing these crops. It's creating their diet. Now remember, nomads, because they were nomads, they have to gather their food. Well, now they could actually plant them and survive with crops that they just grew. And they would gather barley and wheat. Those were ones that grew naturally. Dates, lentils, they grew naturally. But they learned to take them and put them into certain spots where they could just harvest them instead of going around everywhere trying to gather them. Now, also remember that they used to raise animals, sheep, goats, cattle. They would drink their milk, they would eat their meat, they would use their wool, and they would also use them for labor in the farms. So before, they would actually have to go with the area. They had to move around to be able to keep these animals alive. They didn't have set spots where they could just thrive, because most of the animals, you get enough cattle around, they're going to eat you dry. There's not going to be a blade of grass anywhere because they're constantly eating. I mean, literally constantly eating. They don't stop. Unless they're sleeping or resting, they're eating. So during this time, they created land for those cattle, and they would move them from place to place to be able to do it, but all around the same area. Now here's another thing. They would also create, in this new society that they're creating, they also created community. So community, basically a group of people coming together and helping with each other, or everyone doing a certain job and selling it to another person. Everyone benefiting from another person. So this is like the earliest capitalism, where they start off as families, but when the families came together and other families joined them, they would then sell and trade between them. Now, capitalism it did not start off as money. There was no money. It was trade. I will trade you for this because I need that. And you can trade me for this because I need that. And you need that. Okay, so it's trading. It's going back and forth forever. But at some point, they come up with a currency, which we will get into that in the future. But as of right now, their capitalism is actually to produce what they produce the best and sell it or trade it with the people that don't make it the best, but make other things better, and you trade their goods. Sometimes you'll be able to get a little bit more for your amount, and you could trade that with somebody else, which then became a trader. Not a trader as in giving up your nation, a trader as in you can trade with other people. You become the middleman, and you're trading between different people, and this is what created traders. And then especially here in the Middle East, they had the Silk Road, which was basically a road or a path that would lead from places like Egypt to China, and China to Europe, and Europe down to the Arab nations. So this was a great working together of early civilization, all thanks to Mesopotamia. Now, as we talked about, Africa had basically the same thing in different ways. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is early society in Mesopotamia, settlements and cities. Now, here's the thing. No one grew a huge city overnight. It would take a small little village with maybe a family or two, and then they would add on a few more families and they create a town, and then add a few more families because there's plentiful. It's a land of plenty. You're being successful. People want to join you because you're being successful. They want to be successful. They're going to join you. And these great cities. Some of the earliest cities were Urudu, Uruk, and Ur. Now, remember these. Now, if you go back to when we were talking about ancient Israel and also Egypt, you would have heard of Uruk and Ur. So these are two of the most popular and most influential cities that would become. And we're going to not talk about them as much today, but stay tuned. But here's one other thing that I thought was interesting. This is a little bit of rant, a little bit off topic, but it talks about Uruk. Uruk became this massive, massive country, or massive city. You want to see it on the front of your curriculum? That is Uruk. I mean, massive. They had temple mountains, basically. Their cities were built on man-made mountains. and they still stand today. Now, they're uninhabited. They can't be inhabited, but the buildings are still there. Everything's crumbled. But I was watching a documentary on, was it Disney Plus? It was from the National Geographic, and it was on the secret treasures, or something like that, secret treasures of the Bible. And it was talking about the Great Flood. Now, you might say, well, that's just a Bible story. No, actually, it's a Mesopotamian story. It did. That's actually where it began, where it was first written down. The Bible was written afterwards. And so, interesting enough, the flood was actually documented in multiple places in Mesopotamia. So in Mesopotamia, they actually said that Uruk was the first city that was designed after the flood. Now, we were just talking about floods. So there was a massive flood in Mesopotamia, which, again, people from around the world actually have records of it, including China. So this is very interesting. Okay, so you have this great land where, if you go see the documentary, it's really interesting. It's the second episode. I'm curious as an archaeologist and historian. Again, not trained in school, but a made it myself kind of historian. So I am constantly learning more about history. So here's the great thing about this. Mesopotamia, they had stories of the flood. They have a different story of creation because that's not actually something that they were there for. So however the world was created, they have one story, the Bible has another story, but they all have the story of the flood, which is very significant because we were just talking about floods. It's also very significant because Uruk was supposedly the first city after the flood. And Uruk still has evidence of the flood built in its soils. That was what was really interesting about this documentary, but done by National Geographic too, so totally non-biased as far as we know. But all the people were archaeologists and historians from all different walks of life. I think the main one that I liked was actually, he was a Muslim, and he was from Arab countries down south, and his countries had actually already had also stories of the flood. And so Iraq is basically where the earliest records would be, and so that's why he went there. Now, ongoing, let's go a little bit further. Okay, so now we're talking about, let's see, yeah, we got plenty of time. Okay, now let's talk about the governments and leadership. Now, like I said, these civilizations, these modern villages that became towns, that became cities, started off with a family. And the family grew successful. That's why other families joined it, or their family grew, and it became bigger and bigger, from villages to towns to cities, and so forth. And these would be hubs of family relationships. But when it grew bigger than family relationships, they were hubs of trade, religion, and culture. Okay, so there we go. Now, you might be asking, okay, so if all of a sudden they become a city, that would be chaos if they didn't have anyone ruling over them, being a leader. So each city was ruled by a leader, often a priest king, which means that he was a religious leader. So he would, sorry, got something in my throat. Actually, you know what? That's why I brought water, and that's why I do this when I do this. Okay. So now, this religious leader may be religious and a leader, but it does not mean that he was a religious leader. Okay. These leaders organized the construction of temples, management of trade, and coordinated the efforts of the irrigation. Again, like I said, they might not be the actual head religious person, but they were a priest and a king. They had a grouping of both being religious and a leader, which is the same thing that you will find in the Incans, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Egyptians, and a lot of the earlier civilizations. Why? Because they believed that the leadership came from those that were actually the ones that knew the faith that they had, the joint culture, the joint faith. Now, some might say, remember what I said, every time a new leader comes into play, they usually change two things. One, it's the history. They might alter it. They might change it. They might leave it alone. And the religion. Because if they become the center of the religion, then that allows them to have more control. Now, if they are also able to change the religion so it benefits them, I'll give you an example. King Henry VIII, he did not like that the Catholic Church would not let him divorce his wife, who would not give him a son. So what did he do? After killing a few of them, he then created the Anglican Church, the Church of England. Yes, that was a leader that came into power and decided to change some things to benefit him. Now, we don't know anything when it comes to Mesopotamian religious leaders, because there are records of it, but not so far back as we're talking about right now. Again, we're going to go into the later on civilizations as we go. So let's jump from the leadership. Let's go to religion. Now, the people of Mesopotamia were highly religious. And you could tell by some of these. The mountain cities, those weren't all cities. Those were temples. They were mounds with temples on top of them. Basically where people could commune with God, with their God or gods. And so they built these temples and they worshipped their gods. Now, in this, they built the ziggurats. They had their life basically built around that. So the religion, it influenced their irrigation. It influenced their raising of animals. It influenced their families. It influenced everything. So that is something to know. They were highly religious, but not how you would see it as like Christians and Muslims working together. This is more of, because those are monotheistic religions. The Mesopotamians were a mix of monotheistic and polytheistic. And polytheistic was sometimes considered the more popular one, where there's not just one god, there's many gods for different things, such as the water, the weather, the land, such. The animals, the gods of the animals. I don't know. I don't actually know all the religion of the Mesopotamians. Now let's go into how we actually know about the religion, the governments, the cities. How do we know about Uruk? Well, this came from their writings and record keeping. Mesopotamia developed one of the first in the world, first writing system. It was called cuneiform. Cuneiform was basically, you take clay tablets, and actually, in your curriculum, you're going to receive one of these. This is a clay tablet. Now, again, it's not a tablet yet, but what you're going to do is you're going to smooth it out when you get it. You're going to smooth it out. It's all wrinkled and stuff like that. That's fine. Roll it out with a rolling pin to make it smooth. Then, because this is how they would write in cuneiform. Then we're going to give you the tools to be able to write in the clay a message. Now, you can write it in English, or I challenge you to write it in cuneiform. Now, you can actually get the instructions of how to write in cuneiform online. But write it in cuneiform. Write a message to someone. Have them translate it. Let it dry. You can even put it in a kiln, because this is actually potter's clay. So you can actually put it in a kiln and it will dry it, or even put it in your oven, though it's going to take a long time to do it. But that way you can keep your writings, and you can keep that forever. You can also actually smooth this out a little bit more if there's multiple of you, and cut it in half. Smooth it a little bit more and get a thinner layer, because the tablets you find in Mesopotamia were not always this thick. They're actually fairly thin. Not totally thin, because when drying it would crack and you'd lose your information that you had in there. But ongoing. And this is the mud from the fertile soils that we talked about earlier. But they would write these things and keep records. Some of the earliest records are things like there's multiple tablets. There's one that's called the King's List. And it basically writes down all the kings from before the flood and after the flood. Interesting. So archaeologists and historians, they're mixed. Some believe that there could have been a flood. Some believe that there was no flood. Interesting enough, the Mesopotamians believed that they were there during that time, and they wrote about it with the kings that they believed were before the flood and those that were there after the flood. So That's really interesting. I think that's highly fascinating. Whether it's 100% true of the kings, I don't know. I would actually believe that there was a flood because there's just too much evidence to say there was no flood. Okay, so let's keep going. Society. Let's do the societal structure. Like I said, there was priests and rulers. Sometimes there were priest kings because they would be mixed on the higher level. So there was almost a societal hierarchy. You have priests and rulers. They managed the religious and governance of the country. Then you have the farmers and artisans. The farmers and artisans were the ones that produced the foods, the goods. They made things. They crafted. They constructed. They did all these things in order to better the lives of everyone. And then you had the slaves. Yes. So early on, there were no slaves. But as these competing villages or towns or cities would fight, they would capture the people and make them their property. Now, sometimes the slaves were not the same way as you'd think as before the Civil War in the southern plantations. Sometimes they would assimilate those people into their society. Though they would still serve them and had no real rights, they would not be objects, lifeless objects, as some people would see them, or such. Though they would actually keep them for labor. Prisoners of war would work, one for their freedom, or forever, permanently. So the structures of the cities basically were built by slaves, most of the time. The large structures of cities were built on slaves. Every civilization, almost every civilization in ancient times had slaves. It was different depending on who each of them were or who the civilizations were, but they were all built off of slavery. Now, interesting enough, these were not African slaves. These were more of slaves in Mesopotamia, in close by villages or towns or even cities. So when they went to battle, they'd capture them. If they went in raiding parties, they'd capture them. They'd grab people depending on how fast their city was building. And then the hope is that that slave could actually get out of slavery at some point, but no telling if they could. So I hope that helps. So you're going to get into this new curriculum. It is fascinating. It is so great. I love this. This is actually one of the most fascinating because it's one of the most earliest portions of organized civilization. Africa was great. I loved learning about Africa, but Mesopotamia actually has full cities that everyone knows about, and it's the center of. Let's go through it. You have the Assyrians, you have the Babylonians, you have the Persians, you have the Greeks, you have the Egyptians, you have the Romans. All of these people try to take over all this land. So you are at the center. Africa, it was done in different ways. They were taken over by like traders moving in and then taking over the areas, or influenced from incoming religions and such. This one was all by battles and wars. So we're going to go over that. And this spurs on to, I mean, seriously, right now. As you can tell, we have, let's see, the last war in the Middle East where they're trying to take over other lands was probably the Gulf War. So, Desert Storm. It's when, can't remember exactly, Bahrain and Iraq, I think, yeah, we'll look that up. Trying to remember, my dad was in that one. He actually served in the Coast Guard, but he helped the Navy to figure out how to maintain and guard the coastlines, not just from other countries, but also from other influences from around the world. So, like, not neighboring countries, but those from around the world. And so the U.S. Navy was in charge of that, but the Coast Guard had to teach them because that's what the Coast Guard does. They safeguard the U.S., the coastline. They guard the coast. Yeah, Coast Guard. There you go. So the Navy goes to foreign lands. So in order to keep that safe, they had to learn how to do that as well. So, anyways, Thank you so much for joining us. We will catch you next time. That would be on Thursday. Can't wait to talk to you. Take care. Bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.